Welcome to Pathfinding. Hello and welcome to Pathfinding. So today's topic is going to be, why did God wait 400 years to deliver the Israelites from slavery in Egypt? So recently, Dr. Jordan Peterson has been hosting a Bible study that he's been posting to his YouTube. And the first one was on Genesis, and the second one was on Exodus. And so I came across a clip on there, which, to be honest, I was a little bit surprised about. So why don't we have a look at that clip and we'll discuss it.
One could have asked the same question in Egypt. Why did God wait so long? How many Jews were killed and beaten and tortured until God, quote unquote, remembered? So,
well, maybe the cry is it partly the possibility that, like, man has to reach up to God just as much as God reaches down, and then without Moses being there as the precondition for, in some sense, for God's intervention, then it's not going to occur.
right, but that doesn't put God off the hook.
Okay, so what we have here is Dr. Peterson sitting with 6 theologians, and they're quite well-renowned theologians, and one of them is Dennis Prager. I think all the rest are Christians, and Dennis Prager is Jewish, and he's a Jewish scholar. And they're discussing what is the reason why God let the Israelites languish in slavery in Egypt for 400 years, until, as we know, Moses came along and God worked through Moses to bring them out. That is what the Exodus is. And I was a little bit surprised, to be honest, that Dr. Peterson and the 6 theologians were kind of scratching their head on this one and theorizing. And even if they couldn't really come up with an idea about the reason why God just left them there for 400 years, 4 centuries in slavery, I was kind of surprised, if we just go to this next image, that they didn't reference the earlier events in the Bible, back in Genesis. So this quote comes from a time when God had chosen Abraham, or you could say Abraham chose God, and God asked Abraham to make some sacrifices. And it was a pretty difficult sacrifice because he had to cut heifers in half. But eventually, when he got to the end of the sacrifice, at the end of the day, there was some birds he was supposed to cut in half, a dove, and burn them on the altar. But he fell asleep and he didn't complete the whole task. So when he woke up, there was a dark mood upon Abraham. And God said to him, well, let me read the verse from Genesis 15:13. Actually, God said, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. So again, let's read it again. Then the Lord said to him, meaning to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. Okay, so God has chosen Abraham, who is going to set up his family, and his family is going to grow larger and larger until it becomes the entire 12 tribes of Israel. And from a Christian point of view, the culmination of Israel is the appearance of Jesus. And so God gave Abraham a really important responsibility, and he gave him certain tests and tasks to fulfill so that they could go forward. In a similar way that God gave Noah a responsibility, and obviously he gave him a big task to do, which is to build the ark. The problem with Noah is it all sort of got destroyed, meaning the way God was working through Noah came to nothing to a certain degree, or became destroyed, because although Noah had great faith for 120 years, he built the ark and saved his entire family as a result. But at the end of it, when Noah was an old man and he was probably tired from doing all that, there's a scene in the Bible where Noah gets a little bit tipsy, he gets drunk, and he goes into his own private tent and he lays down naked to rest or sleep. And his sons, Shem and Ham, they are ashamed of their father being naked and maybe being drunk. So they walk into the tent, but they walk backwards so they don't have to look at him. And they put a blanket over him. And after that, God is really angry with them. And it was 10 more generations before God could start again and call somebody like Abraham. And the reason why it all crashed down with Noah, it might seem like a small thing, but it wasn't just that Noah's sons were a little bit concerned about their old dad and they wanted to cover him up. It's that they were disgusted with him. After he'd shown such faith, when the entire world was ridiculing him, and the end result of that was everybody else died and Noah survived and his family survived, they should have seen Noah as if he was God himself practically. But instead, they looked down on him like he was a disgusting person for being naked and being drunk. And it was the emotional breach of this kind of disdain that they had for their father. Because when Adam and Eve fell, it's because they also had disdain for God's word and they instead engrafted to Lucifer. And they followed Lucifer's way, not God's way. And ever since then, all humankinds have had this breach with God. And actually, that's what religion means. Religion means from Latin, religio, which means reconnect, because ligio is like a ligament, a connection. And so God has been working with humanity to reconnect human beings to him. Not in a kind of a legalistic way or in a kind of a, well, we're back together like a family, long-lost family coming back together, but a real emotional engrafting. And it's been very difficult for God to guide humanity on that path. And so God tried initially with Cain and Abel, and that failed, obviously, because Cain killed Abel. And then he tried again with Noah, and it was going great until Shem and Ham basically developed a disdain for Noah, which means they had a sort of a disdain or disgust for the thing which could connect them back to God. And then God tried again with Abraham. He found somebody who was faithful. Abraham's father was actually an idolater, or actually an idol maker. And he used to make idols. And I think Abraham smashed them up, and then he left. And so God recognized somebody who could have strong faith in me. And God's plan is to create a people of his own. In the Bible, what's described as a priestly people. And that means refining them internally to such a degree, but it's not just a symbolic, poetic plan. God is practical in the same way that God created the universe. So the entire universe, we don't see so much magic, although the effect is magical. We don't see legalistic things. We see that there's a process to everything. Everything in the physical universe works according to a process and a logic and takes time and develops. And so when God is working in the spiritual ways with us, it's the same thing. You can see in the Bible that there's a process and there's time periods set. And just like in the way that we might cook something, or we might germinate or incubate flowers and bulbs to grow into tulips or something, there's a process that we put everything through. And so in the same way, God is preparing a people so that they might produce something that is needed for the salvation of all humankind. And what God is actually doing is he's setting up a refinery. So if I go to this next slide, then in Isaiah 48:10, God says, "Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction." Let me read that again. "Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction." So when Dennis Prager and Dr. Peterson and all the other theologians are scratching their head and wondering, well, God is all powerful. Why didn't he rescue them? How terrible it is that he would just leave them to be slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Of course, it's definitely terrible. Like Dennis Prager said, they would have been murdered and beaten and basically just forced to work for hundreds and hundreds of years. So But I'm a bit surprised that they didn't reference the thing that God said to Abraham and why it happened. And it happened because as God is preparing Abraham to become the father of faith, the father of especially of the Israelites, and later of the Christians, as God is preparing Abraham, he gives him certain tests and certain processes to go through to improve himself. And one of those tests was to show initially great faith in God through the sacrifices, which he completely failed. And sometimes what will happen is God will give somebody a test or a process I prefer the word process to go through, because test just sounds like, just testing, but a process to go through so that person can be refined and improve. So God gave Abraham a process and he failed it, but sometimes when people fail, they get a more difficult process to go to restore the thing they failed. So what was the more difficult thing that God gave Abraham is he asked him to sacrifice, meaning kill, his only son, Isaac, the son who Abraham and Sarah had grown old and still didn't have children and longed for children and thought it would be impossible. And so when they had Isaac, obviously it's going to be the apple of their eye. They're going to love him so much. So you can imagine how difficult it was when God told Abraham, all right, you failed in the sacrifice of all these animals I asked you to sacrifice. You didn't culminate it by sacrificing the doves. So instead, you have to sacrifice your son now. And that's a far greater sacrifice to make, a far greater trial for Abraham. But Abraham had great faith, and he must have had terrible regret for not following God's orders in the first sacrifice. So he actually went through with it. He bound Isaac up, and then he was going to kill him, and God sent an angel to stay at Abraham's hand and say, don't harm the lad. God didn't need the actual sacrifice in that case. He needed the show of faith. And again, it wasn't just a show of faith. Abraham had to go through a process in order to get to the point where he's actually committed to doing God's will, which is sacrificing his son. And in a way, that sort of refined and restored Abraham. So now Abraham's in a position where he can expand his family. And as we know, Isaac gave birth to Jacob and Esau, and Jacob and Esau gave birth to all those sons who became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. So now God has a whole nation of Israel to work with. And so even though Abraham sort of restored it, he only restored his mistake in the sense of he got himself back on track. God didn't have to abandon the whole thing like he did with Noah. But God had said to Abraham, because you failed in this thing I asked you to do, your descendants will be slaves for 400 years. So the question is, what is the reason for that? So instead of asking, as those theologians did, instead of asking, why didn't God save them from Egypt at any point, we ask, why did God have them go into that situation in the first place? Because in the former, if you're just asking, well, why didn't God stop it? They were suffering. Why didn't God rescue them? It's kind of talking or thinking as if the God's providence is ad hoc, as if God's providence is something that God can just make decisions with at any moment of any time. In a sense, God doesn't actually decide what the needs of his providence are, in the same way that doctors don't actually decide what treatment to give sick people. What doctors do is they use their training to understand how somebody is sick or how they're damaged. And then how somebody is sick or damaged is what determines what treatment they will get. What the doctor does is he looks at the situation they're in, and because he understands medicine, he can recognize what treatment they need. It's not a decision the doctor makes. It's something that they require, the patients. And in the same way, when God wants to help human beings and God wants to fix us, he looks at the condition we're in, and spiritually in our fallen state, And then God decides what is the way to help them come back to God and to be healed spiritually. So instead of thinking, well, the Israelites happened to have found themselves in slavery in Egypt, why didn't God help them? We need to go back to this Genesis 15:13 and ask, why did they have to go into Egypt and become slaves for all that time? And I think there's clues in the Bible. If we look at, for example, when the Israelites finally did have the Exodus, when they finally did leave Egypt, and they went into the desert, God promised them the land of Canaan, land of milk and honey, where they could settle and set up a nation. And they were ready to actually go into Canaan. And Moses sent 12 spies, 12 tribes, 12 spies into Canaan to look around the land and figure out who the enemy are and what the lay of the land is, and then come back and give a report. And I assume Moses and God were hoping that they would come back and they would say, okay, here are the challenges, and this is the city we should conquer first, but we can do it, let's get in there. But actually, when they came back, 10 of the 12 were all doom and gloom and spreading fear throughout all the people of Israel, telling them that the people are strong in there, we can't fight, we're not strong enough. It was only Joshua and Caleb who said, we've got the Lord on our side, so we can defeat anybody. And so actually what happened was God did not let them go into Canaan. In fact, the entirety of all the people who came out of Israel, apart from Joshua and Caleb, died in the desert because God wouldn't allow them to go into Canaan because of their lack of faith. And in fact, they had to spend 40 years in the desert. They had to spend 40 years living in that harsh life in the desert. And it was only their descendants, their children, the next generation that went into Canaan. And so if we ask ourselves, was that just punishment? No, it wasn't punishment. God looked into the hearts of the people of Israel in the desert, and he knew they had to have strong faith and strong hearts in order to survive and win their battles in Canaan. But because he looked into their hearts and he saw that they didn't have that strength of character and especially faith, he knew that letting them go in Canaan would be the same as destroying them. They'd go in there, get into battles, lose, and they'd be destroyed and maybe all killed. So he had them stay in the desert another 40 years so they could toughen up, prepare their spirits, prepare their minds. So the next generation, as we know, they went into Canaan, marched around Jericho, destroyed it, and took over the whole land and settled it. So going back into Egypt, perhaps if Abraham would have succeeded in the first sacrifice, it would have been a sign that Abraham himself had stronger faith, and that would have had a knock-on effect to his children and the tribe that he built, and perhaps there would have been no need for them to go into Egypt and become slaves under a satanic regime, basically. So when God sees in that situation that his people don't quite have the faith and the strength of character to do what needs to be done, then God has to give them a path that will toughen them up, even though that path might be terrible. You could say, for example, with the Israelites in the desert who didn't have faith to take over Canaan, it was a cruel thing to make them live 40 years in the desert and all die there before the next generation could go on. But it would have been much more cruel to let them all go into Canaan and get completely wiped out. So God doesn't always have choices in these matters. And so I think that when God let the children of Jacob follow Joseph into Egypt, and of course in the beginning they were heroes because Joseph saved Egypt, but over time people forget the good things that were being done for them, and they were a separate people. And so eventually the Egyptians, the powerful Egyptians, came to resent and even hate the Israelites. And so they became more and more, they probably went from free people to indentured servants into eventually just slaves until they forgot that they were never slaves in the past. And it was just normal for the Israelites to enslave them. But in that process, they had houses, because they had to smear blood on the doorpost when the Passover was happening. They had houses and they had families and they had culture. And so over that time period, they were able to develop a culture. And it's often the case that when a people are oppressed by another power, it actually galvanizes their character and their culture and their faith. It's interesting, I was living in Korea for 8 years, and I found something very weird there. If you look at Korean history, especially recent Korean history, first of all, Koreans have an interesting history in that they've never invaded another country in all their history. They have a very long history, Korea, but they've never invaded another country. But they've been invaded by the Mongols and by the Japanese and by the Chinese and by the Russians. And in recent history, the Russians tried to oppress them by imposing communism. And just after the Korean, and obviously Japan invaded them and colonized them in 1905, and was terrible. The treatment of the Koreans by the Japanese was truly terrible. Japanese wiped out their royal family, and they enslaved hundreds of thousands of girls and used them as sex slaves in Manchuria. And they killed so many Koreans. They were truly terrible. And then the Chinese have invaded Korea many times, and especially during the Korean War, they sent 3 million Chinese to invade North Korea. So you would think that the Koreans would have terrible resentment to the Japanese and to the Russians and to the Chinese. And to some degree, they did, but the newer generations less so. But in Korea, they were liberated by American troops. Well, actually, initially by American troops who liberated them in World War II from the Japanese, and then saved the southern half of Korea with a UN coalition that was mostly Americans. And the Americans liberated Korea, and they supported Korea financially and infrastructure-wise, and there was very little bad behavior by American soldiers, the occasional outlier, but they were very kind to the Koreans, and they even, of course, Korea was initially, after the Korean War, it was a dictatorship, but it evolved very quickly into a thriving democracy and fantastic economy. So what I found in Korea, especially with anybody under 50 or 40, is they hated America and they hated Americans. And I couldn't understand it for a long time. And I would talk to Koreans and I would ask them why. And they would kind of twist everything. Oh, America's motivation is they didn't want to help us. They just wanted to use us as a market to sell us goods, which didn't make sense because they had tariffs on all American goods. And so you never saw any American goods in Korea. Anyway, I thought for a long time about why they're so negative against America. Instead of the country that helped them and saved them, instead of against Japan and China. And I realized something crazy. It's because when Japan oppressed Korea, and Russia oppressed Korea, and China oppressed Korea, that galvanized their culture. So even though individuals suffered and groups suffered for a duration, after they were liberated from those people, the Koreans had even more sense of their identity. But America did something that Koreans could never forgive them for. They gave them freedom and a free choice. They could choose Korean clothes or Levi's jeans, American clothes. They could choose Korean traditional music or Elvis Presley and the Beatles and other music. So they could choose all sorts of options, the American way of life or the Korean traditional way of life. And of course, in the 50s and 60s, American culture was so bright and so attractive. So many Koreans started to forget their culture and abandon their traditions and culture and just live an American lifestyle. But then they start to feel that loss of culture inside. But it's very difficult to blame yourself when you've harmed yourself or your culture. So they project it onto Americans, and they're resentful against America for giving them freedom. So that's an example that I'm going back to make a point about how the Israelites in Egypt, under the oppressive regime of the pharaohs and the Egyptians, for 400 years they would suffer that. But even though they did kind of forget they didn't really have that much theological background going back to Abraham, but they knew their history and they knew who they were as an identity and as a people. And so that period that they spent in Egypt as terrible as it was, it's something that formed them. As the phrase says, behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction. So it galvanized them and purified them. And if they had not gone into that state in Egypt, a state of slavery, what eventually became slavery, they may have just dissipated and become nothing. Just actually exactly as they did. The 10 tribes of Israel, later in the history, we call them the lost tribes, they got swallowed up by the general world, and they lost their identity, and nobody knows who they are now. There was only 2 tribes left by the time Jesus arrived. And so the question is not so much why didn't God rescue them when they were suffering, it's why did God allow them or even cause them to go into Egypt and becoming that state. And I think the reason is so that they could become a real people. And obviously the wider question is, why did God want Israel to become a people, to become his people? The phrase that I like is they're described as being a priestly people. So in the tribe of Israel, you had 10 tribes, and one tribe was the Levites. And the idea was the Levites didn't really have to work so much. I guess they survived on tithes from the other tribe. And that's so they could focus on the spiritual things and the religious life and becoming a priest tribe to the rest of the other tribes of Israel. And in fact, in a way, that's what an ascetic life and a religious life is to improve yourself and refine yourself. But actually, the whole nation of Israel itself was one great refinery system with the objective of producing something. Sometimes when they want to produce purest gold, they have to put vast amounts of rock and gold mixed in with all sorts of impurities into a big machine, and it gets smashed and crushed down into fine powder, and then it gets put into a furnace and heated so everything burns away. And of all that massive amount of rock and gold from the gold seam in the mine, you get a massive amount, but in the end, after everything's refined away, you just get a tiny little bit of gold at the end. And so the real purpose of the people of Israel, as it says in the Bible, God says to Abraham, I will bless the whole world through you. So God's choosing Abraham and the people of Israel isn't just for the people of Israel or just for Abraham, it's actually for the world. It's the Jewish people, the Israelites, that took on the burden of the suffering and difficulty of affliction and being refined and having the harsh lifestyle. And the purpose of it is to first refine each individual person according to how much effort they made in their life of faith. But then we see constantly in the Bible how God is selecting lineages to bring them together. Even people who are not really Jewish people, like one of my favorite books in the Bible is the book of Ruth. Ruth is not an Israelite. Is she from the half tribe of Manasseh? Is that half Israelite? But anyway, she must have had such a good soul and maybe even such a good lineage that God wants her to become not only an Israelite, but she becomes a part of the lineage that eventually produced Jesus. Isn't she the great grandmother of King David or something? Which himself was a descendant, an ancestor of Jesus. And so the idea is that God refines all these people in the nation of Israel. Some of them do better, some of them do worse. And it's not even about how well the individual does in refining their soul. It's more the pattern of how many descendants in a line can refine themselves again and again. so that it has a cumulative effect. And so eventually what happens is, relatively, you have some lineages in the Israel tribes who are more pure than others. It could be even just a tiny bit of difference. So it's not like one is a perfect saint and one is a super evil person. It could be just a tiny amount. But again and again, if God, through his providence, can guide those people with slightly more refined lineages to marry, and then again and again, and bringing more lineages in, eventually God is working to refine a lineage or a whole set of lineages that will converge, just as we all have like 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. And all our lineages converge to create each individual. Just as when we have children, they diverge and create more and more individuals. And so God's objective is to produce Jesus Christ. And as it says in the Bible, just as one man's sin, which is one man's disobedience brought sin into the world, through one man's obedience, sin will be taken away from the world. So the first man is Adam, who sinned and with Eve, and sin was brought into the world. And then the second Adam, which we call Jesus, is the person who removes sin from the world. But to produce Jesus, God doesn't just do a miracle, snap his fingers and make it happen. In a way, you could say that God uses the exact same process he used to produce any animal or any person in the natural world. How did we get Homo sapiens? There was a vast number of animals, and they're all generation after generation changing and evolving, and eventually the characteristics come together, and eventually you get different types of animals. And one of them was a whole wide branch of primates, and then one branch of those is hominids, and one branch of those is Homo sapiens. So in the same way, God is working through an actual process, and part of the process is that he's refining people, and that the people who refine themselves the best way, and especially in a series of pattern with their multi-generational, God brings them together. And eventually, after hundreds and hundreds of years and hundreds of generations, you get so many of the higher quality refined people that it raises their level of holiness and refined nature to the point where they can give birth to somebody who is so refined that he's able to break away from sin and grow to perfection and become the new ancestor. That's why Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. Obviously, Abraham chronologically came before Jesus. Jesus is stating that he's now the original ancestor because he's perfect and one with God, and we all engraft to Jesus. So he becomes our father, and then we all become his descendants. Even the people in the afterlife who were born hundreds or thousands of years before Jesus, they actually become Jesus' descendant, not his ancestor. And so going back to Dennis Prager and Dr. Peterson's head-scratching conundrum about why God just left them in Egypt, God has a purpose for the things, especially with central figures and providential people like the Israelites. And so I think we can trust, instead of just blaming God, or as Dennis Prager said, put God on the hook. I think we can trust that God has a good reason for these things. And sometimes when we see something difficult or like suffering, we act like it's binary. Like, well, you can have not suffering or suffering, but actually it's not always binary. So, for example, when you feel pain, obviously it's better not to be in pain, but actually the pain, there's a second option, and that's you could get damage. So it's not the option is pain or not pain. The option is actually not pain, pain or damage. And seen from that point of view, we would rather have pain than damage. And so we don't object to pain so much when we understand it in the wider context of pain alerts us to the damage. So in the same way, looking at the wider picture that God will be seeing, of course, it's terrible what the Israelites experienced in Egypt, but God not being able to set up a people through whom he could produce somebody like Jesus to save the entire world and save people's eternal souls is far worse. So it's just a tragic thing that the people of Israel were tasked with enduring that suffering so that they could refine their souls and eventually go on to produce Jesus. So, yeah, we can't deny the objection to the suffering, but it's not just something that was just happened to be happening and why didn't God stop it from happening? It's obviously, if you look at the whole pattern of the Bible, it's something that was required. Probably it wouldn't be required if Abraham had a stronger faith. Not saying that it was a punishment because Abraham didn't have faith. It's just a reality that if there was a stronger faith in that moment, then that would set the course. But because there wasn't a stronger faith, then that faith had to be supplemented by having Abraham's descendants galvanized, by living in that compressed, difficult situation where they're oppressed. And so just like as I explained with the Koreans, they get a stronger sense of their identity. And as we saw, as the way they behaved in the Bible, worshiping the golden calf, and then later in Canaan, when they settled, 10 tribes disappearing, even with that, it was difficult for them to hold it together. And so, yeah, I think that's my talk on the reason why God didn't rescue earlier the Israelites from Egypt. They weren't ready for what God had in store for them. And living that way in Egypt galvanized them and made them become a people with a strong sense of identity, so that when they did come out of Egypt, they were ready for the next stage, which was to receive the 10 Commandments and to set up the tabernacle and to evolve further as God's priestly people. So, yeah, thank you for listening. And I will be talking more about biblical things because I am actually watching Dr. Peterson's talks, and they're amazing and fascinating. And so every now and again, I see something in there and I just think, oh, maybe I'll give a talk on that. So the next talk I'll give relating to what those guys were discussing was on the meaning of the burning bush when Moses went to the mountain and the angel of the Lord appeared and represented God as a burning bush. And they had some interesting things to say about that, but I think I have something I can add. So I'll be checking that out. So yeah, please check out our pathfinding channel on Rumble. Obviously, we're on YouTube. And path__finding is also on Twitter, which is now called X. I'll put that in the description. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next Pathfinding Talk.